The subject of this video is Shabbat, the Sabbath. And this video is part of a larger series of videos dealing with Jewish holy days. Again, I'm purposely using the term holy day and not holiday because the term holiday in English has connotations of fun, enjoyment, vacation. And the Jewish holy days are not meant to be a time of fun, enjoyment, vacation. The Jewish holy days are meant to be a time of deep and profound spiritual experience. So in this video, I want to examine the meaning of the Sabbath from a spiritual point of view, not from a halachic legal point of view, from a spiritual point of view. I want to look at the meaning of the Sabbath, the concept of the Sabbath from a spiritual point of view by examining, by focusing on three passages in the Hebrew Bible, three passages that stand out in the Hebrew Bible in which the concept of the Sabbath appears. So the first passage is the opening account of the Bible of the creation of the universe. And it's here for the first time in the Bible that the term Sabbath appears. Well, according to the account, God creates the universe in 6 days, and on the seventh day it's written that God stops, ceases, and this is the literal meaning of the term Shabbat in Hebrew, Sabbath, to stop, to cease. So that God stops, ceases, it's written, from doing the creative work that God did in creating the universe. Okay? Now, I want to say some words here about creative work, that in Judaism, in the Jewish tradition, not all work is prohibited on the Sabbath. What is prohibited is creative work. And the term is milacha, and this is the term that appears here in the opening account of creation when it's written that God stops, ceases from doing the creative work, milacha, that God did in creating the universe. Now notice in the opening account of creation, the prohibition, from a legal point of view, the prohibition of doing creative work on the Sabbath, the prohibition in the Jewish tradition, the prohibition is not found in this opening account of creation. Okay? Again, what's written is that God stops from doing the creative work that God did in creating the universe. But the prohibition is based on this concept. It's a prohibition of doing creative work. And I want to say a few words parenthetically about this prohibition that's the main expression of the Sabbath from an external legal point of view. Again, I want to focus here in this video on the spiritual meaning of the Sabbath, but I'll say a few words parenthetically about the prohibition of doing creative work on the Sabbath in the Jewish tradition. So first, I want to clarify what's meant by the term creative work. If on the Sabbath I move a heavy piece of furniture, which very clearly is physical work, physical exertion, that does not constitute creative work. Work in general, but it's not creative work. I'm not violating the Sabbath by moving a heavy piece of furniture on the Sabbath. However, if I light a match, which doesn't involve really any kind of physical work or physical exertion, that does constitute creative work. I'm creating a fire. And so what the term milacha, creative work, means is it's work that is unique to the human being as an animal, distinguished from all other animals. According to the opening account of creation, the human being is distinguished from all other animals. It's the human being who is created in the image of God, distinct from all other animals. And what that means then, that the human being is created in the image of God, is that the human being is the only animal who has the power to create and to transform nature. To create a fire, other animals cannot create fire, and to transform nature, to take what is God-given, like wheat, and to make it into something even better, bread. So now one other thing the second thing that I want to point out in this regard, regarding the concept of creative work, is the concept of tikkun olam, repair of the world, as a fundamental concept of the Jewish tradition. The concept tikkun olam in Hebrew, repair of the world, doesn't appear in the Bible. It's the first source in which it appears in the Jewish tradition, of which I'm aware, is the prayer Aleinu. That's a part of our prayer service in traditional Judaism. And there the concept appears, litaken olam, to repair the world. In this ancient prayer that has its roots going back to the ancient Talmudic period, the prayer Aleinu. But even though the term tikkun olam, repair of the world, doesn't appear in the Bible, the concept, the idea, not the term, the concept, the idea has very, very strong roots in this opening account of the creation of the universe of the Bible. So that on the sixth day, when God finishes the creating of the universe, God looks over all of creation and says, Hine tov ma'od, behold, it is very good. God proclaims that the universe is very good, but not perfect, less than perfect, and therefore in need of repair, improvement. And it's again the human being who is the only animal created in the image of God who has the power to repair, to transform, to improve the world. So that we have a duty from this opening account of the creation, we have a duty in the Jewish tradition to repair the world, to improve the world. Okay? So now I want to go back again to the opening account of the creation of the universe. The meaning, the first thing that I want to point out in relation to the story is that this is the first time where the concept of the Sabbath appears, and what it literally means is to stop. Just as from the verse there on the seventh day, that God stops from doing the creative work that God did in creating the universe. The second thing I want to point out in relation to this story is that this is also the very first time in the Bible that the term holy appears, holiness. And it appears on the seventh day in connection to the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a day that is to be holy, sacred. So I want to examine the nature of the holiness of the Sabbath. And I want to do that by comparing the Sabbath to the tabernacle. The tabernacle is the central place of worship in the biblical literature, in the biblical period. Okay? And the tabernacle was a portable tent-like structure that the Israelites take with them in their wanderings in the wilderness, and then when they entered the land of Israel. And eventually it evidently was incorporated into the temple, which was a permanent structure that was built in Jerusalem, the ancient temple, that became the central place of worship in the ancient biblical period, the temple. And in the tabernacle and in the temple, the central form of worship was animal sacrifice. Okay, so that the tabernacle then is the central place of worship in the biblical literature. It's a central place of ritual worship, and the main form of ritual worship in the tabernacle is the performance of animal sacrifices. Now, the commandment to build the tabernacle is in chapter 25 of the book of Exodus, and from chapter 25 of the book of Exodus until the end of the book of Exodus, the central theme is the building of the tabernacle. Now, the tabernacle then is a holiness, it's a place that is holy, and it's a holiness of place, of space. Okay, it's a structure. When you have a place, and a structure, that means that the holiness of the tabernacle is a holiness that is of a physical, material nature. The tabernacle is a structure that we can enter into. And the form of worship within the temple, of animal sacrifice, and the main animal sacrifice, that's a physical, material form of worship, of ritual worship. So that the holiness of the tabernacle is of a physical, material nature. By contrast, the Sabbath, Shabbat, is a holiness of time. And time is something that is entirely spiritual, of an entirely spiritual nature. It's not physical and not material. So that the essence of the Shabbat is an internal spiritual experience. We do have external expression of the Sabbath, like the prohibition of not doing creative work on the Sabbath is an external legal expression of the Sabbath. But the essence of the Sabbath, of the holiness of the Sabbath, is an internal spiritual experience. And that experience is meant to be, according to the Jewish tradition, a time in which one day each week, a holy day, one day each week, in which we are to experience, to have a taste of the world to come. Now, the world to come, olam haba in Hebrew, the world to come is a central concept of the Jewish rabbinic tradition, the ancient Talmudic tradition, and the concept of olam haba oftentimes is understood as referring to life after death, but the concept symbolizes very deep spiritual fulfillment. So when we say, according to the Jewish tradition, that the Sabbath is to be a taste of the world to come, it means it's to be a taste of spiritual fulfillment, that we're to experience deep spiritual fulfillment. By the way, the concept of an afterlife, of life after death, doesn't appear at all in the Bible. The entire emphasis in the Bible is upon life in this world. The Bible is almost entirely silent about life after death. The entire emphasis is on life in this world, and the emphasis is on redemption of this world, again, of making this a better world, of improving this world. Okay, so that the Sabbath then, according to the Jewish tradition, is to be a time that we're to have a taste of the world to come, of deep spiritual fulfillment. It's an experience of deep spiritual fulfillment, and a time of complete peace and joy. Now, peace, we greet each other on the Sabbath, and even prior to the Sabbath, we greet each other Shabbat Shalom, a Sabbath of peace. Now, peace in Hebrew, shalom, isn't just an absence of violence or war. It's peace in the sense, again, of a very deep feeling of fulfillment, of harmony. It really means peace. It comes from a Hebrew root, shalem, that means whole, wholeness, completeness, and harmony. So that the Sabbath then is to be a time of complete peace, of fulfillment, harmony, and also of complete joy. Oneg Shabbat is another concept of the Sabbath. Oneg Shabbat means the joy of the Sabbath, that it's to be a time of complete joy. And there's actually, and what that means is a complete joy. That means that the essence of the Sabbath as an internal spiritual experience, it means that what we're to stop from, Shabbat, the literal meaning of Shabbat, that we're to stop, we're to cease. What we're to stop from in the main, even more important than the external prohibition of stopping from doing creative work. That's a means, the external prohibition of stopping from doing creative work is in order to have the internal spiritual experience. And the essence then of this internal spiritual experience is that we are to stop, to cease. This is the very essence of the Shabbat from a spiritual point of view. We're to stop and to cease from being preoccupied with our own personal concerns. We're not to be worried. We're forbidden from being worried on the Sabbath. We're prohibited from being sad, from being upset, from being angry. Prohibited. There's a remarkable story told in the Talmud that of Rebbe Meir and his wife Bruria. Rebbe Meir, one of the great Talmudic scholars, and his wife Bruria is the one example in the Talmudic literature of a woman who is a Talmudic scholar. And the story is told that on one Sabbath, Rebbe Meir is away from home. Evidently, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember right, he's in synagogue and he's teaching. And their two sons, Rebbe Meir and Beruria, their two sons die on the Sabbath while Rebbe Meir is away from home. And so when he comes home, Beruria doesn't tell him that the two sons have died. And she waits until the Sabbath ends to tell him. Because it's forbidden for him to be preoccupied with personal concerns, to be sad, to be worried, and so on. And now this is an extreme story, but the story is coming to teach then how important this idea is, that this is the very essence of the Sabbath, that we are prohibited from being preoccupied with our personal concerns. We're absolutely forbidden to be on the Sabbath, to be worried, sad, angry, upset. It's to be a time of complete joy, complete peace and harmony and fulfillment, of spiritual fulfillment. Okay? So that's the first passage that I want to look at here in connection with the Sabbath, is the opening account of the creation, in which this is the first time that the term Sabbath appears. When God, it literally means to stop. God stops from doing the creative work in creating the universe. And that it's the first time also where the term holiness appears, that the holiness of the Sabbath is of an entirely, holiness of time, an entirely spiritual nature, in which we're to experience deep spiritual fulfillment and peace and harmony and joy, complete joy. Okay, the second passage that I want to examine is the 10 statements, what is called the 10 Commandments in English, but this is really a misnomer, a mistranslation, 10 Commandments. The biblical term in Hebrew is Aseret HaDevarim, which means 10 statements. And the Talmudic rabbis also used a similar term, Aseret HaDibrot, which means 10 statements. And there are commandments among the 10 statements. In fact, most of the statements are commandments. It's actually the first statement that's the one statement that stands out as being a declaration, a statement, and not a command, where God declares, I am the Lord your God, who has brought you forth out of the land of... It's a declaration of God directed to the Israelite people, to the Jewish people. I am the Lord your God. I am the Lord your God, who has brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Okay, so the 10 statements now actually occurs twice in the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. The first place that it occurs is in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, and then it appears in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 5. Now, in both of these passages, the prohibition appears, of the prohibition of doing creative work on the Sabbath, appears in both these passages of the 10 statements. Now, there are two significant differences between the passages of the book of Exodus and the book of Deuteronomy. In the book of Exodus, chapter 20, it's written to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And again, the concept of holiness appears connected to the Sabbath. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 5, it says, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So these two concepts then of remembering the Sabbath day to keep it holy and observing the Sabbath day to keep it holy, these are actually complementary concepts. As the remembering of the Sabbath day is referring to the internal spiritual ideals that the Sabbath symbolizes. Again, the spiritual experience, the spiritual ideals of fulfillment and peace and harmony and joy. Okay, so that's what's meant by remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy is referring to the external expression of these internal ideals. The observance, the actual ritual aspect of the practices. So that would include then, in the main, the prohibition of doing creative work on the Sabbath, but also we have other expressions of a ritual nature. For example, we make Kiddush on Shabbat, which is Kiddush is from the root meaning holy, sacred. And so Kiddush on the Sabbath, we make over wine, is sanctifying the Sabbath day. It's making it holy. And we make blessings over a cup of wine in the evening and in the morning. We sanctify the Sabbath. And the wine symbolizes the complete joy of the Sabbath. And so that's an external expression of the Sabbath, of observing the Sabbath, as we sanctify the Sabbath over wine. We also have festive meals as an expression of the Oneg Shabbat, the joy of the Sabbath. So that we have external expressions of the Sabbath. So that these are two complementary concepts. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, the ideals internally, the spiritual ideals that the Sabbath symbolizes, peace and joy and fulfillment, and the observance of the Sabbath, the external ritual aspects of the Sabbath. Okay. The second difference between these two passages is that in the book of Exodus, when it's written, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, the reason given, it's written there, therefore, we're commanded to observe the Sabbath day, to keep the Sabbath day. The therefore is referring to what's written there is what's referred to as the creation of the universe. That's the reason given for observing the Sabbath. Therefore, we're to observe the Sabbath. Okay, is the account of the creation, where the first time the term Sabbath appears. In the book of Deuteronomy, the therefore, that we're to keep the Sabbath day, to observe the Sabbath day, is referring to the Exodus from Egypt. So here I want to say a few words about what the connection is between the Exodus and the Sabbath. As what's written there is that, again, that the Exodus is the story of God redeeming the Israelites from slavery, out of Egypt, redeeming the Israelites from slavery. So what's the connection to the Sabbath? Again, the Sabbath is to be a time of deep spiritual fulfillment and peace and joy. And slavery is a position or a status of being oppressed. And the opposite of peace and fulfillment, it's being oppressed. And our history begins then, as the Jewish people, begins with the Exodus from Egypt, that our ancestors were slaves in Egypt, oppressed, and who, according to the biblical account, were redeemed by God out of slavery. And it's from here that we learn that God is a God who is a moral God who demands morality. It was a fight against injustice and oppression. And the Sabbath then, I think we lose sight in the modern world of how revolutionary this concept is of the Sabbath. In the 20th century, into the 20th century in the United States, oftentimes people worked 7 days a week. Men, women, children often worked 7 days a week. They had off during the course of the year, maybe just a few days of vacation during the course of the year. And for the most part, they worked 7 days a week. Men, women, children. So the Bible, several thousand years ago, is proclaiming the Sabbath day, a day in which no one works, does this creative work. No one in society. Not men, not women, not children, not slaves, and not animals are not to be worked. So that it's not just that society is to be given rest from the domination of the human being, that again, if we go back to the opening account of creation, it's the human being who is the only animal who has the power to transform nature, to create and transform nature. And according to the opening biblical account, the human being is given dominion over nature, the power to dominate nature. That's what this means. And it's from that power that we are stopping, we are desisting again. We're stopping, ceasing from using that power, not just over other human beings, not just over animals, but over all of nature. On the Sabbath, we're forbidden to pick a flower or a blade of grass. all of society, all of nature is to be given rest from the domination of the human being. So that's the connection then between the Exodus and the Sabbath there in the book of Deuteronomy. One other thing that I want to say in relation to the 10 statements and the Sabbath. If we go back to the story in the book of Exodus, chapter 20, immediately following the 10 statements, the Israelite, and the 10 statements were proclaimed, in the plain meaning of the text, the 10 statements were proclaimed by God to the entire Israelite people, including Moses. Now, immediately following that revelation of the 10 statements, the Israelites request prophetic mediation of Moses, for Moses to speak with God on their behalf and to mediate between God and the Israelites. So the Israelites request prophetic mediation of Moses, and they say to Moses, "You speak with God, and then we will understand." Now, they say, "You speak with God, and then we will hear." Okay, they say, "and we will hear." Now, the term "hear" in Hebrew can mean either to hear physically or to understand. So, just as in English, I can say, "I hear you." I'm not speaking about hearing in a physical sense. "I hear you" means I get what you're saying. I understand you. Okay? So, the same in Hebrew. The term "hear" in Hebrew can mean hear physically or hear in the sense of understand. And it's very clear when the Israelites are requesting prophetic mediation of Moses, they're using the term in the sense of understand. "You speak with us, and then we will understand." They're using it in the sense of hear, understand. "You speak with us, and then we will understand." And why is that clear? First of all, just as a matter of logic, it would be absurd to assume that God would speak in a way in a voice that the Israelites wouldn't be able to hear physically. That just seems absurd from a logical point of view. But apart from that, immediately following the 10 statements, when Moses does give the Israelites further commandments, not found in the 10 statements, further commandments, these commandments, and there are many, many of them, okay, that follow the story of the revelation of the 10 statements. Many, many commandments follow in the 5 books of Moses. And what characterizes these commandments is that they are very, very different in both form and content, very different in nature in both form and content from the commandments of the 10 statements. So that if the Israelites simply didn't hear the revelation of the 10 statements in a physical sense, they didn't hear, then why would Moses give them commandments so different in nature and form and content? Moses could simply repeat the commandments that God gave in the 10 statements. But Moses doesn't do that. He gives very different commandments in nature, both in terms of form and content. And what that indicates then is that the Israelites did not understand the revelation. That's what they're saying to Moses. "You speak with us, and then we will hear, we will understand." So Moses gives them, okay, first let's look at the 10 statements, the nature of the commands. The nature of the commands in the 10 statements are absolute commands that are of a universal nature. They don't apply to any particular society or any particular culture, any particular time period. They're of a universal nature. "You shall not murder. You shall not steal." And these commandments are of an absolute nature. Absolute. Okay, and this gives a feeling that these commandments are of a moral nature, moral imperatives, moral commands that apply in all circumstances, in all time periods. Okay, they're not dependent on any particular conditions or any particular time period. Now, following the 10 statements, the commands that Moses gives to the Israelites through the prophetic mediation of Moses, the commandments that the Israelites are given, are of a conditional nature, and they're not universal. They're not absolute, and they're not universal. They're of a conditional nature. For example, in chapter 21, again, the revelation of the 10 statements is chapter 20 of the book of Exodus. The very beginning of chapter 21, the book of Exodus says that if you own If you acquire a Hebrew slave, then this is the law. So it's a conditional law. If you acquire a Hebrew slave, now notice that the Bible doesn't prohibit in an absolute sense slavery. It doesn't require slavery in an absolute sense. It's a conditional law. If you do own a Hebrew slave, this is the law. So the Bible, slavery was a reality in the social, slavery was a reality in the ancient biblical world, the ancient Israelite society, and in the ancient biblical world in general, slavery was a social reality. And the Bible then regulates the owning of slaves. Okay, so that's an example of conditional law. Now, such conditional law was known throughout the ancient Near East, even before the Bible. We have, through archaeology, we have ancient law codes that were discovered, Hittite law codes, the law code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylonia. And in these law codes, you have laws of a conditional nature, the same as in the Bible. Okay, but the absolute universal commands of the 10 statements, that you do not find any precedent in ancient Near Eastern literature that's been uncovered by archaeology. This is something unique to the Bible, a part of the revolution of the Bible. So that, to go back then, the Sabbath is the only statement in the 10 statements and the only command that is of a ritual nature. So that, again, we speak of the tabernacle in distinction to the Sabbath. The tabernacle, the central place of worship, and the central form of worship was animal sacrifice in the tabernacle. The command to build the tabernacle and to offer sacrifices comes after the 10 statements. It's not a part of the 10 statements. And these are laws that are of a conditional nature. Animal sacrifice, having a tabernacle, was part of the ancient biblical world. These were things that were familiar to the ancient Israelites. Okay? So that this is something that comes after and outside of the 10 statements. But the essence of the revolution of the Bible, okay, and the essence, and here I want to say the essence of the revolution of the Bible is that God demands morality. And morality is entirely spiritual. So that the Shabbat is as an internal, moral, spiritual experience. A holiness of time is a part of the 10 statements. So I want to again make clear what this revolution is of the Bible. And I'll say a few words about this great revolution that's reflected in the 10 statements, and especially in the concept of the Sabbath, okay, as the only ritual practice found in the 10 statements. So what is the revolution of the Bible? It's reflected in the very opening statement of the 10 statements. Again, God doesn't declare to the Israelite people, I am the Lord your God who has created the universe. Because from the creation of the universe, what we would learn is that God is inherently powerful, but not necessarily inherently moral. From a purely logical point of view, it could be an evil God that has created the universe. It's from the creation of the universe, we learn that God is inherently powerful, but not necessarily inherently moral. It's from the Exodus, again, when God declares in the opening statement of the 10 statements, I am the Lord your God who has brought you forth out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Out of the house of slavery meaning out of oppression. It's from here that we learn that God is not only a powerful God who has created the universe, but God is in the main a God of revelation and redemption. Redemption, a God who is a moral God, inherently moral, who demands morality. And again, in the pagan world, the surrounding pagan cultures in the biblical period, the surrounding pagan cultures to the surrounding the ancient Israelite culture. In the ancient pagan cultures, the gods were conceived as forces of nature, powers of nature. A god of sun, of wind, of rain. And as powers of nature, these gods, forces of nature, were inherently powerful. Not inherently moral, inherently powerful. And they could influence human affairs, to interfere in human affairs, to the benefit of human beings, to the detriment of human beings. They could help us, they could harm us. So that the essence of religion in the pagan conception is the performance of ritual practice. In particular, animal sacrifice, but ritual in general is the essence of religion. And ritual has the function, then, of influencing, appeasing the gods, the powers of nature, of appeasing them, of finding favor in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the gods, so that at least, if they don't help us, at least they won't harm us. Okay, this is the pagan conception, and morality in the pagan conception is outside the confines of religion. It's a civil matter, outside the confines of religion, morality. The essence of religion is belief in the existence of belief in these powers of nature, and ritual practice is a way of appeasing these powers of nature. Okay, so this is the pagan conception. Now, the revolution of the Bible then, reflected in the 10 statements and in the opening statement, I am the Lord your God who has brought you forth out of Egypt, out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, that God demands morality. This is the great revolution of the Bible, that for the first time in the history of humanity, God is conceived as a God who is a moral God, inherently moral, who demands morality. And a God of not just a God of power was created the universe, but in the main a God of revelation and redemption, a moral God who demands morality. And therefore the essence of religion is morality. Morality now is not outside the confines of religion as in the pagan conception. Not only is morality not outside the confines of religion, it's the very essence of religion. And to such an extent, it's the essence of religion that the entire nature of ritual changes, the function of ritual changes. So that the function in the ancient pagan world is to appease the gods, to influence the gods from below to above, to influence the gods that they'll help us or at least not harm us. To try to influence God in the biblical conception, that's considered magic in the biblical conception, and that is absolutely forbidden. It's considered an abomination by the Bible to try to influence God. So that the nature of ritual not only is morality then the essence of religion and not ritual. Morality is the essence of religion and not ritual. Not only that, but the function of ritual changes, so that the function of ritual is not to appease God, to influence God, to change God. The purpose of ritual is to transform ourselves. Ritual is to be an expression, an external expression of moral and spiritual values that Judaism demands, that God demands, according to the Bible, that God demands and that Judaism demands. So that ritual is to transform ourselves. Just parenthetically, one example, prayer. On a widespread basis in the Western world today, and in the Orthodox Jewish world, okay, you find on a widespread basis a pagan conception of prayer, where people pray to influence God, to receive from God sustenance, livelihood, health. We want to receive things from God by praying. That's a pagan conception. That's considered magic in the biblical conception. It's considered to be an abomination. The reason to pray in the biblical conception is to transform ourselves. And actually the ancient Hebrew word for prayer, tefillah, Palel, it's a reflexive verb that it literally means to judge, but it's reflexive. It means to judge ourselves, to examine ourselves. Prayer is a time when we're in the main examining ourselves of how we can help to make a better world. We're not waiting with our arms folded as if poof, some magic from above, it's going to be a better world. The redemption, again, we have the power created in the image of God to repair the world. Prayer is a time when we're examining ourselves. What are we doing to repair, to improve the world? Okay, so this is the great revolution then of the Bible. And therefore, the Sabbath, which is also of morality as the essence of religion in the great biblical revolution, morality is entirely spiritual, non-physical, non-material. So the Sabbath is the only ritual practice because its essence is this internal, moral, spiritual experience of peace, of joy and deep spiritual fulfillment. This is the only ritual practice then that is a part of the 10 statements. Okay? Now, the last passage that I want to look at is in chapter 31 of the book of Exodus. And this is a passage that is a part of our prayer service on the Sabbath. And it's found in chapter 31 of the book of Exodus, verses 16 and 17. And I'll read the translation in English. And the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations, for a perpetual covenant, perpetual and eternal covenant. It is a sign, notice the term sign here, it is a sign between me, God is speaking, it's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. Okay? So I want to examine two things in this passage. Okay? The first thing is that the Sabbath here in this passage is a sign of an eternal covenant between God and the Jewish people. Now, in the Bible, there are two covenants that are central from a religious point of view between God and the Jewish people. The covenant of Abraham and the covenant of Moses. The Sabbath is a sign, and that's what's written here in this passage, it's a sign of an eternal covenant between God and the Jewish people. But the Sabbath is a sign of the covenant of Moses. The covenant of Abraham, the sign is circumcision. Okay? Now, I want to say a few words about this notion of covenant that's so central in the Bible, because the Sabbath is a sign of the covenant of Moses. So, Judaism is a religion, not in an orthodox sense, orthodox correct belief. That's the literal meaning of the term orthodox in Latin. Judaism is not a religion in an orthodox correct belief sense of a faith commitment. Judaism is a religion, for insisting on using Latin terms for some reason, in an orthoprax sense, correct deeds. It's a religion in the sense of, in an orthoprax, correct deeds sense of a way of life of the Jewish people, a way of life, a culture of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people is a people in a nationalistic sense, not a racial or an ethnic sense. From the very beginning of Jewish history, there have been Jews of differing racial and ethnic background, and anyone can convert and become a member of the Jewish people regardless of racial or ethnic background. So that Judaism is a religion in the sense of a way of life, a culture of the Jewish people. And Judaism is a religion that has both of these elements that are an integral part of Judaism as a religion. The notion of Judaism as a way of life and the notion of Jewish peoplehood. And these two elements are the two basic elements of these covenants. The covenant of Moses is the element of Judaism as a way of life. And the covenant of Abraham is the element of Jewish peoplehood, that Abraham is the father of the Jewish people. And these two covenants then, by the way, I also want to add that what defines us then as a people is not a faith commitment, notice. What defines us as a people is not a faith commitment. And it's also not a traditional lifestyle of observance of Jewish law or Jewish ritual practice. What defines us as a Jew is simply being born of a Jewish mother, having converted. And also what unites us as a people is not a faith commitment or not a traditional lifestyle of observance of Jewish law or Jewish ritual practice. What unites us is being a part of a people with a shared language, Hebrew, of the Jewish people, with a shared land, homeland. The land of Israel is the national homeland of the Jewish people. We have a shared history as a people and a shared culture, heritage. This is what unites us, so that you have Jews who are both Jews that are both secular and religious. And you can have then, in principle, a secular Jew who is a non-believing Jew, doesn't believe in the existence of God at all. A Jew who is non-practicing, non-believing and non-practicing. A secular Jew doesn't believe in God and doesn't practice a traditional lifestyle of Jewish law and ritual practice. And yet this secular Jew, a non-believing, non-practicing Jew, is loyal to his or her people and to his or her heritage and culture. So, and these two elements then, that are the two fundamental elements of Judaism as a religion, our way of life, our culture, our heritage, and our peoplehood, of belonging to a people. These are the two covenants, symbolized by the two covenants of Abraham and Moses. And the two are intimately connected, so that in the essence of the covenant of Moses, of Judaism being a way of life, the essence of Judaism as a way of life is that Judaism demands morality. In the biblical conception, God demands morality. Judaism demands morality. This is the essence of our way of life. Not faith and not law or ritual practice. If I had to point to one verse in the Bible that captures the essence of religion in the biblical conception, it's the verse in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 18. And it says, and you shall do that which is right and good. Right here is actually righteous. You shall do that which is right, righteous, and good in the eyes of the Lord. And notice the orthoprax conception, correct deeds. The emphasis on doing, not believing. You shall do that which is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. And the emphasis is not only on doing orthoprax, but it's also on morality. Not faith, not law or ritual. Morality, righteousness, goodness. Okay? And also the very name of the Jewish people in the Bible, the main name given to the Jewish people in the Bible is the name Israel. Yisrael in Hebrew. And if you divide it in the middle, it contains this very same word, righteous, yashar, that appears in the verse, and you shall do that which is right and good in the eyes of the Lord. You shall do that which is righteous and good, yashar. And the name Israel, if you divide it in the middle, is yashar el. It literally means righteous of God, that we are to be a people devoted to a life of righteousness, right living. And that then is the essence of Judaism as a way of life, is morality. And so Abraham then, as the father, the spiritual father of the Jewish people, is singled out by God. In the book of Genesis, it's in chapter 18, Abraham is singled out by God as being a person who exemplifies the essence of Judaism as a religion, morality. Abraham is singled out by God there in Genesis chapter 18. God says that God knows Abraham to be a person who will keep the way of the Lord. And what is the way of the Lord? To do. Again, the orthoprax, correct deeds, emphasis on doing, not believing. To keep the way of the Lord, to do justice and righteousness. Again, morality. Not law and ritual practice. The essence of Judaism is as a way of life is morality, justice, righteousness, right living. And this is what Abraham symbolizes or exemplifies as the spiritual father of the Jewish people. So that the covenant of Abraham, the sign is found in Genesis chapter 17, is the circumcision. And the sign of the covenant of Moses is in this passage here that I've just read, chapter 31 of the book of Exodus, chapter 31, verses 16, 17, that the sign is the Sabbath, the sign of the covenant of Moses. Okay, so that's one point with this passage. The second point that I want to make is with the concluding sentence, where it says that it's a sign, God says, it's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever, the Sabbath. It says, because in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day God rested and was refreshed. Now God rested. The rest then is like the purpose of the Sabbath. The prohibition of doing creative work is in order that we have this experience of spiritual rest, of deep spiritual rest. Okay? And so again, the prohibition is an external expression that's a means to create this internal experience of rest. Now, so that we stop, the literal meaning of the term Sabbath is to stop to cease. We stop from doing creative work. It's in order to rest. Okay? And it says, it's in Hebrew, Shabbat vayinafash, that God rested. Shabbat, God actually stopped, it literally says, but it's to rest is the implication, that God stopped to rest and was refreshed. Okay, vayinafash. Now the word vayinafash contains within it the word nefesh, which is often translated as soul. In a widespread basis, it's translated as soul, the word in Hebrew nefesh. But that's a problematic translation. You can translate it that way, but you have to be careful. It's problematic. Why is it problematic? Because of the influence of Christianity. Christianity is characterized by a dualism, and this is an influence of the ancient Persian culture, of what are called Gnostic mystery cults that influenced Christianity in its development, and also the ancient Greek culture, that there were these mystery cults, Gnostic cults. And what characterized these Gnostic mystery cults that so influenced Christianity is a kind of dualism of mind and matter, spirit and body, spiritual and physical. And everything, and what characterized these Gnostic cults was that everything that's spiritual is good and eternal, and everything that is physical, material, bodily is seen as sinful, evil. And this influenced Christianity. So Christianity is characterized by this kind of dualism between soul and body, between spirit and matter. And so that everything spiritual in Christianity is seen as good and eternal, and everything physical, material, bodily is seen as sinful and evil. And therefore, the ideal is that of the monk, the priest monk who lives a life of celibacy, chastity, poverty. There's an ideal of asceticism, the denial of physical material pleasures of this world. So Judaism, by contrast, is not characterized by dualism based on the Bible. The Hebrew Bible is not characterized by such dualism. The Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition based on the Hebrew Bible, faithful to the Hebrew Bible, is characterized by a unity. God is one, the universe is one. So that everything in this universe is good. Again, God in the opening account of creation proclaims on the sixth day, Hine tov me'od, behold, it is very good. The entire creation is very good. And the Talmudic rabbis learned from that the entire creation includes what we call in the Jewish tradition the evil inclination. The soul of the human being contains two parts according to the Jewish tradition. Again, this idea has roots in the Bible, that the soul has an evil inclination and a good inclination. The good inclination is the divine part of nature, that we're created in the image of God, and we have the power of reason and conscience, moral conscience, that separates us and distinguishes us from all other animals. That's the divine element of the human soul, is reason and conscience. The animal part of our soul is all of our passions and drives that we have in common with all other animals. But that evil inclination, the rabbis said, when God says, behold, it is very good, all of creation is very good, that includes the evil inclination. It's not evil in an inherent way in and of itself. It's only evil in relation to the good inclination, that the ideal in Judaism is not asceticism, that we deny ourselves physical, material pleasures. The ideal is self-control, that we control our animal side with our divine part of our soul, reason and conscience. We control our animal passions and drives. And the ideal is self-control. But we don't deny ourselves physical material pleasures. And the sexual drive, for example, lust is seen as a terrible sin in Christianity. In Judaism, the sexual drive and lust is a part of our evil inclination. It simply means it's a part of our animal nature. And it's very good. Our entire soul is very good. It comes from a good God. So God cannot create anything that's inherently evil. Everything in and of itself is good, coming from a good God. So that lust, without lust and without a sexual drive, we wouldn't be able to reproduce and continue the human species in fulfillment of the biblical command to be fruitful and multiply. So to go back then, the term soul in Hebrew, nefesh, It can be translated as soul, but we must be very careful that it's not soul in a dualistic sense, a Christian sense of soul in distinction to body. Soul in Hebrew is a holistic concept. It represents the unity of biblical thinking and traditional Jewish thinking, that the human being is whole and the soul is whole, but the human being is whole. So nefesh in the Bible often has the meaning of a person. Okay, not just soul in distinction to body, but of a person. And so it really means there not just that the soul in distinction to the body, when it says that God rested and was refreshed, and that therefore the Sabbath for us is to be a time of refreshment, reinvigoration, renewal, spiritual renewal. But it's a time of rest and renewal, not just of our bodies, but of our entire person. That's what the term nefesh implies, our entire person. So it's also physical rest, and therefore we don't do any creative work on the Sabbath. There's physical rest involved, but it's also for the sake of the internal spiritual rest and reinvigoration, the renewal, this internal experience of deep fulfillment and peace and joy, that we stop one day a week and we don't do any creative work. And the reason, again, that's an external expression, but the ultimate purpose of the Sabbath is this internal reinvigorating of ourselves, renewal of ourselves spiritually. That the holiness, to go back to the holiness of the Sabbath, that's a holiness of time, entirely spiritual, this deep spiritual experience of fulfillment, peace, joy. This holiness then is a holiness of being, not of doing. On the Sabbath, we stop doing, we stop creating. We stop doing. It's a holiness, a spiritual experience of being fulfilled, of being at peace, of being at joy, of being joyful, so that we're not in any way to be preoccupied with ourselves, with our personal concerns, not to be sad, not to be worried, not to be angry and upset. This is the very essence of the Sabbath from a spiritual point of view. It's the very essence of the Sabbath is an experience of being, of experiencing deep spiritual fulfillment and peace and harmony and joy. Thank you.